On the third morning after the battle, a woman named Thea stood at the second-floor window of a house on the hill above the Agora of Corinth, and watched smoke rise from the Roman camp beyond the isthmus, where 23,000 soldiers had settled into the routine of waiting. She was 34 years old, the wife of a man named Aristodemos, who had sat on the Corinthian council for 11 years, and who had voted to reject every peace offer Rome had sent. He had marched out 3 days ago with the Achaean army. He had not come back. The streets below her were empty in a way she had never witnessed in her life. Corinth was a city that never stopped moving. Merchants from Egypt and Phoenicia crowded the docks at Lycaeum before sunrise, shouting prices in languages that mixed and collided like waves against a breakwater. Traders hauled perfume and linen and bronze across the Diolkos, the great stone-paved road connecting the two seas, the sound of their carts grinding against the limestone ruts carrying all the way up the hill. The Agora itself was so dense with bodies at midday that a woman could cross it only by pressing through shoulders and elbows, inhaling the smell of roasting meat and fresh dye and the sharp vinegar tang of wine sold by the cup. On this morning, the only sound was the wind pushing through open doorways and the high, thin whine of a dog somewhere down the slope, calling for an owner who was not coming. She had not eaten since the day before. The household stores were gone, not taken by Romans, taken by Corinthians. Looters had come on the first night, freed slaves and dock workers, and men who had not marched with the army, breaking into homes along the upper streets, while the city had no guards and no law. They had taken the grain, the oil, the amphoras of wine from the storeroom. They had taken the silver drinking cups from the andron, the dining room where her husband had once hosted visiting diplomats from the League. They had pulled the bronze mirrors off the walls of the bedchamber, worth a month's wages each. They had not touched Thea or her 2 daughters, 12 and 9, who had hidden in the cellar behind a false wall. Aristodemos had built years earlier when piracy along the coast had made every wealthy household cautious. The men were looking for things they could carry and sell, not people, not yet. On the second day, a neighbor named Daphne had come to the door with her 3 children and told Thea what she had heard from a potter's apprentice who had watched the battle from the slopes above the isthmus. The army was destroyed. The Achaean cavalry had broken first, outnumbered 6-1 by Roman horsemen who struck the flanks like a door swinging shut. Then the infantry collapsed. General Diaeus had not stayed to rally the survivors. He had not tried to hold the walls. He had mounted a horse and ridden south to his home city of Megalopolis, where he poisoned his own wife to keep her out of Roman hands, and then swallowed poison himself. Thea listened to this. She absorbed the fact that the commander of the Achaean army, the man who had started this war, who had arrested peace advocates and rejected every negotiation, had not considered defending the women and children in the city he was supposed to protect. He had considered only his own wife, and the mercy he offered her was death. Now, on the third morning, she could smell burning cypress from the south, carried on the wind off the Saronic Gulf. It mixed with something else, something acrid and thick that coated the inside of her mouth. From the storage room behind her, she could hear her younger daughter coughing, a dry, persistent sound that had started on the first night and had not stopped. She pressed her palm against the stone of the window frame and felt it cool beneath her skin despite the August heat, and she thought about what she had been in this city 1 week ago, the wife of a councilman, a woman who wore gold at the Isthmian Games and sat in the reserved seats, a woman who climbed the path to the temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth twice a year to leave offerings of perfumed oil and silver jewelry, praying for the safety of her household and the prosperity of the city. A woman whose name, when spoken in the Agora, produced recognition. Through the window she could see the 7 great Doric columns of the Temple of Apollo, standing against a sky that should have been blue but was stained brownish-gray by smoke. Beyond them, rising 550 meters above the plain like a fist of limestone punched up through the earth, the massive rock of the Acrocorinth. The temple of Aphrodite sat at its summit. 300 years earlier, when the Persian king Xerxes had marched on Greece with an army that darkened the land, the women of Corinth had gathered at that temple and begged the goddess to save them. The poet Simonides had commemorated their prayers in an epigram that was carved into a tablet and placed in the sanctuary. Aphrodite had listened. The Persians were defeated. Greece survived. Thea did not know if anyone was praying up there now. She did not know if it mattered. What she could see, on the plain beyond the walls, was movement. Ordered formations of men, their equipment catching the morning light in rhythmic flashes as they assembled into columns. They were coming. But before I tell you what happened when the Roman consul Lucius Mummius finally walked through those gates on the third day, I need to take you back to the city this woman once knew, and show you what Rome was about to destroy. If this is your first time on the channel, you are about to hear the story of what happened to the women of Corinth in 146 years before the Common Era. You are going to learn how a city that controlled 2 seas and generated more wealth than any other in Greece was reduced to ash and silence in a single week. How the wives and daughters of the most powerful men in the Greek world were stripped of their gold, catalogued by age and skill, and sold alongside household servants on platforms at the slave market of Delos. How priestesses, who had served the most famous goddess in the ancient world, were marched in chains to the docks of the city they had once prayed to protect. And how the same year Rome destroyed Carthage, it destroyed Corinth, and the historian Polybius, who watched both cities burn, walked through the ruins of his own people's civilization and saw Roman soldiers playing dice on priceless Greek paintings they had thrown on the ground. Subscribe if you want to hear the full story. This one does not end well for anyone. To understand what Rome took from the women of Corinth, you first have to understand what those women had. Corinth sat on the narrowest point of the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland of Greece, and this accident of geography made it one of the richest cities in the ancient world. It controlled 2 harbors. Lycaeum opened west onto the Corinthian Gulf, giving access to Italy, Sicily, and the trade routes of the western Mediterranean. Cenchreae opened east onto the Saronic Gulf, connecting Corinth to Athens, the Aegean Islands, the grain markets of Egypt, and the luxury goods of Asia Minor. Every merchant who wanted to move cargo between east and west without risking the storm-lashed route around the southern tip of the Peloponnese had to come through Corinth. The Corinthians had even built the Diolkos, a stone-paved road across the isthmus, where entire ships could be dragged overland on wheeled cradles from one sea to the other. The city charged for every transaction, and the revenue never stopped flowing. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Corinth had a population estimated at 90,000 people and a reputation that reached every harbor in the known world. The historian J.B. Salmon titled his authoritative study of the city simply Wealthy Corinth, because no single word captured its identity more accurately. Corinthian artisans produced pottery and bronze work that commanded premium prices from Iberia to the Levant. Corinthian purple dye, extracted from murex shells harvested in the Gulf, competed with the famed Tyrian purple for the most expensive textile coloring in the Mediterranean. Corinthian shipbuilders designed war galleys that were copied across the Greek world, and at every level of this economy, women were present. The wives of Corinth's merchant families managed households that functioned as commercial operations. They supervised domestic slaves, managed inventories of trade goods stored in residential warehouses, tracked debts and payments, and in many documented cases negotiated directly with suppliers and ship captains when their husbands were away. These were not women confined to back rooms. Corinthian society, while still structured around male authority, gave its women more economic visibility than most Greek cities permitted. The wealth demanded it. when a merchant household controlled inventory worth more than most families in other cities would see in a lifetime, the wife who managed that inventory held real power, even if the law did not formally acknowledge it. The wives of the political elite occupied a different but equally prominent position. They dedicated offerings at the city's temples, sponsored public festivals, hosted diplomatic guests, and displayed their family's wealth through jewelry, clothing, and the number of personal attendants they brought to public events. At the Isthmian Games, held every 2 years outside Corinth and attended by athletes and spectators from across the Greek world, the wives of councilmen and generals sat in reserved seats, wearing gold that announced their status as clearly as any title. And above all of this, literally above the city on the great rock of the Acrocorinth, stood the temple of Aphrodite. The geographer Strabo, writing several generations after the destruction but drawing on earlier sources, recorded that the sanctuary had once possessed more than 1,000 sacred servants, women who had been dedicated to the goddess by wealthy donors as acts of piety. The Greek word he used was hierodoulai, sacred slaves. Scholars continue to debate